Did anything else from that piece, that article, resonate with anyone? Or do you have any initial reactions?
It made me think of I think just our first lecture about like how to world build and the different options that you have. So some of them being like start from scratch versus, just change one thing. So the idea of like filling in the gaps. So it's like there's this story and you can just like fill in the gap with something completely new. Like, oh, let me tell this one character's backstory. That just, yeah, that it made me think of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anyone else?
I guess one thing that, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
Oh, it made me think like, I guess I was expecting the article to be more about like how to incorporate like myths and stories that your characters are telling each other,
Yeah.
like as opposed to like a reimagining of a real life myth.
Yeah, that's a good
point. And there's kind of, it made me think like, oh, there's also, there's kind of blends of the two as well, because you can have like, myths in your fictional world that are kind of based on real life myths, but also exist in your world.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes people say that we've told all the stories. There aren't any new ones, and the reason we keep coming up with new books and new TV shows and movies and everything is because we're hearing the same stories but told from different perspectives and with new styles and whatever. And so the same thing can be true about the worlds you create. The stories, the myths that are within your world are just new versions of the stories that we have out here, if we've truly told all the stories.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts or reactions?
It made me really curious about all the myths that I don't know yet, and all of the stories that are out there that I don't know. I love folklore and I studied religion in college, so just all of this is so fascinating to me. And I also was thinking about the last lesson and the like how to be careful about telling new stories that I'm not familiar with, but also not culturally appropriating those stories.
Yeah. Do you have any insights or anything you want to call back from the discussion last time about cultural appropriation? Like what will you do going forward if you want to incorporate myths from other cultures that you're not as familiar with?
Research. Lots and lots of research. Researching the story, researching the culture, researching the values of the culture and the way that the myths fit into it, and what stories they're telling within the stories. What are they trying to teach?
Yeah, awesome. Any other thoughts about this article? I wanted to bring in this article because I think a lot of people, when they're creating something new, they don't necessarily know where to start. It feels like you're just staring at a blank page if you want to create an entire mythos for your imagined people from scratch. And that's a similar intimidating feeling that a lot of people feel when they start the world building process. But what I want this class to get across, and what I wanted to show in this by having you read this article, was that if you want to write a story, if you want to build a world, you don't have to do a lot of original creation, actually. You can draw heavily on things that already exist. So the benefit of facts-based world building is that if you are relying on what science and research has already determined is true, then you don't have to make up your own stuff. And when it comes to the actual story that you tell or the stories that your characters know, you don't have to start from scratch there either. You can incorporate stuff that already exists and twist it a little bit to suit your needs and your goals for your story or your world or whatever. Hopefully that makes it feel less overwhelming, like beginning the process. Cool. I read the christening last night, and to be totally honest with you, after reading it, I couldn't remember why I originally assigned it. I was like, what was I thinking with this piece? So if anyone has thoughts and you think that like this piece can provide some insight for world building, I am happy to hear them because I couldn't remember what I was trying to do. So does anyone have thoughts?
Yeah, I was wondering the same thing.
Anyone else?
I was like, oh, I'm really interested to hear what Moya has to say about what this has to do about this.
Yeah.
But I mean, maybe I don't know. It was such a weird story. It was I looked it up to try to find like context for the story, and I mean, there's just a very minimal Wikipedia page. Maybe there's other stuff that I didn't find, but it almost seems like it's just like this actually happened to this guy, and he just like printed this story in the newspaper or something.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a very like straight kind of account of this terrible thing that happens, and the dangers of alcohol.
Right.
And
Yeah.
also like also how the character is so, I guess he's like the narrator, I guess, I guess the author is recounting the story told by this doctor, I think.
Yeah.
Who is maybe from a different part of France and is like really prejudiced towards the like natives of this little town in Brittany. And so like, yeah, I guess, I mean, the link that I could see with myths and stories is just like how all the things that they were doing that were like dangerous for the baby were like because of custom.
Yeah. I think that was originally the connection. And so I think this is a classic example of me reading like a part of the story in the middle and seeing, oh, that's an interesting, weird custom. Maybe they explain it later in the story, and then they didn't. And it was just kind of left alone. So, sorry. Does anyone else have other reactions or thoughts to this story?
I thought of it as a cautionary tale / a warning of the power of cultural norms and the power, I guess, ways that we can the to a certain cultural narrative. Yeah, I don't know. I saw it as a warning.
You're breaking up a little bit for me, but I heard warning. I think that's fair. Yeah. Any other thoughts before we move on? Cool. Cool. This lecture, similar to last, is going to be a little bit smaller because to be totally honest, when it comes to folklore and religion, a lot of it is stuff that it's creative, and you're going to make it up, or you're going to draw inspiration from other cultures and use your imagination to twist them into new forms. So this lecture is going to be short, but I do want to have time at the end for an exercise where you come up with a myth that fits in your world, and then we can discuss them. So keep that in mind as we move forward. Can you all hear me okay? Great. All right, so for definitions, broadly speaking, folklore is made up of all the stories that societies tell about themselves. So it's the narrative account of a culture's shared identity. And folklore can come in a lot of different forms. When I saw this chart in one of my introductory folklore classes, that was, I think, the moment when I fell in love with the study of folklore, because there are ways to quantify storytelling and to quantify and categorize the different types of narratives that people tell about themselves and their society. So this 2x2 having on one axis from secular to sacred. Sacred doesn't necessarily have to mean religious. Sacred in this context means key to the fundamental identity of the group. And if you offend, if you attack something that's sacred, or if you remove something that's sacred, then it will actually affect the bedrock of this group's shared cultural identity. And then the other axis goes from factual to fabulous, which so this chart was created by a man named William Bascombe in like the 1800s, and the fact that this is the from factual to fabulous, I just love. So you can chart different stories, different folklore stories on this graph, and different types of stories actually cluster together. So let's start with myths, which I think is something that you should spend some time thinking about for your world. So a myth is a traditional story that explains life's biggest questions. What happens when we die? How did we get here? How were we created? How does the sun rise and set every day? So myths also have to do with a lot of natural phenomena that you see out in the world. But the important thing about myths are that they are deeply embedded in cultures. A lot of these have to do with religion. A lot of them tie really closely to religion. Did I freeze? No, okay, I still see Kiana moving. All right, so myths are usually tied to religion, and one example of this is creation myths or Ragnarok, so things like doomsday myths and apocalypse myths. And myths are sacred to people. That's why they're often associated with religion, and they aren't real. They are fabulous, and so they're like not rooted in fact. But I like to think of myths as humankind's first attempt at science. So when I say that these myths aren't factual, that's not in any way like putting down the people who created these myths, because when a culture creates a myth, it's usually a way to explain something when they like that's the only way they have to explain it. So if you create a myth about eclipses happen because a giant cosmic wolf actually tries to eat the sun, I would really encourage you to avoid coming up with that myth and thinking of those people as stupid for thinking that, because at the moment, with the information that they have, myths are the most plausible explanation for what they are witnessing. And then folk and fairy tales are really important to folklore. I think this is what most people encounter. It's why I started this class with talking about our favorite fairy tales, or the most recognizable tales that we have in our culture. And that's going to change across time and across space. If you go to Russia, then you're going to find people are more familiar with other folk tales and fairy tales than we are. Most of the fairy tales that are really common for us come from European Germanic folklore. But a folk tale or a fairy tale is a story with some supernatural elements like myths, but they deal with smaller issues. So they're not talking about who put us here. They're not talking about where we're going to go after we die. They're talking about morals and ethics and teaching mostly children lessons. So the tortoise and the hare is a lesson about procrastination and feeling full of yourself. And that's like a classic folktale. It's not sacred. If you remove the tortoise and the hare from our shared cultural lexicon or our like shared cultural knowledge, it wouldn't change that much about who we are as a society. Also, there are talking tortoises and hares, so it's definitely not factual. Along this graph, you also have history. So these are factual things that actually happened that aren't, the stories of that happening, the telling of that event doesn't mean much for who we are as a society. The event itself might be very important, which is why I use the example of the Emancipation Proclamation. Like that event is important, but the story of Abe Lincoln, like telling or signing the Emancipation Proclamation, that's not something that people often tell and point to as like a really worthwhile narrative. Does that make sense? Like no one tells the story of Abe Lincoln. He picked up his favorite pen and he was standing in this spot and he did it in this way. Like that's not an important story for us, even though the Emancipation Proclamation is very important. Along that same axis, also if you have thoughts or comments about any of these or questions, feel free to ask them out loud. I see some of you looking kind of thoughtful.
Yeah, I was just thinking about if it's like the message. So going back to the folktale and the myth, if it's like the message isn't necessarily super important, which is what would put it on the secular. I guess that's what you said. Yeah, the message can be more or less crucial to the people, but the fact that that story needs to be told to convey that message is what would put it on the y-axis of factual versus fabulous. Sorry, I'm kind of thinking out loud right now.
Yeah, no, it's I think that the categorization is fun and interesting, and it can give you some guidelines if you want them, but this is also blurry, right? So maybe the star for Tortoise and the Hare should, or maybe the star for the Emancipation Proclamation should be a little bit closer to the right side of this line. Maybe it's more sacred because of the importance of the event itself. But so these boundaries are fuzzy, but it might give you a helping hand when you're trying to think of the different aspects of folklore that you should create for your world. On the other side, you have historical myths. And these are things that are rooted in a kernel of truth, but might be kind of apocryphal. So the story of George Washington cutting down the cherry tree, it was mentioned in the ritual norms piece about the Nasarema that we read last week. This is similar to that, or the reason it was mentioned there is because this is a story that people tell about the founding of America and the values that America stands for. George Washington not telling lies and cutting down the cherry tree, and those two things have been equated. George Washington as a character has been exaggerated, and so now when we tell stories about George Washington, we're telling stories about him as a character, as like an archetype, and we're not necessarily telling stories about him as the person that he actually was. And that's why it's more sacred to us. It's been divorced from truth a little bit, so maybe the star should be further up towards fabulous. It's been divorced from truth, and it's like the keystone, one of the keystones to what America is in like an ideal form. I probably wouldn't care that much if we removed this story from like American culture, because I don't necessarily believe the things that this story teaches, but there are a lot of people who do. There are a lot of people who do feel this way about America and how it was founded. So it's sacred to a lot of people within this culture. And then you have fun things like legends, which are stories that are loosely based on history, but like there's no real evidence for it, or there's evidence for some small elements of the story, like with King Arthur. My cat just totally fell off his cat tree. He's not graceful. But there are people who have studied what, like 1100s Britain, or earlier than that, 800s Britain, and they found examples of different people who might have done some things that got incorporated into the King Arthur legend. And so legends are a little bit of everything. Sometimes they're factual because they're based on kernels of truth, but sometimes they add in magical elements like the Lady of the Lake. And you know, depending on what the legend is about, tells you how secular versus sacred it is. So there are some people who get really caught up on using these words interchangeably, and there are definitely examples of things that shouldn't be confused. Like I would never call the tortoise and the hare a myth. Those things are to me very different. But maybe some people would consider the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation a historical myth, if there were more details wrapped up in the story, and if we like cared more about it, the actual event. Any questions about any of this? I feel like I just spent a long time on it because I've liked classification of folklore. Can you?
I guess like what comes to my mind is like it seems like there's a lot of stories that are factual and sacred. Well, I don't know, like I guess, you know, the kind of history that, you know, they make Hollywood movies out of, that people hold dear to their hearts, like and find sacred, like would those be like historical myths?
Yeah, I think so. And I think maybe the dividing factor here is, are we talking about the characters in this story as actual people with flaws and personalities and like multifaceted whatever, or are we talking about them as a figure, as a figurehead of some idea? So an example that comes to mind is Braveheart, where I've never seen it, but the character is called Braveheart, right? Like that's the general or whatever. As far as I know, that character's like personality and personal life aren't really explored, and it's just, or am I wrong? Am I totally wrong?
I mean, I think, you know, they give him a backstory. He's a mishmash character that I think that movie draws on a lot of different sources,
okay.
And
so
it's kind of
example.
I mean, that's that's fine.
Yeah, but there are these, you know, battles are typically incorporated into historical myth where we can't possibly know everything that actually happened in that battle, but we know the outcome, and we might know who was leading the battle, and so we might turn that leader into a hero. And I think as soon as you turn someone into a hero, where you don't necessarily, and this is becoming less common because we want complicated protagonists these days, or like we have more appetite for that. But as soon as you turn someone into a hero, you're probably not going to complicate their past with anything bad. Like the fact that the movie Hercules doesn't talk about how he, murdered his family and then had to do these 12 labors to atone for that. He's a hero. And in a lot of historical myths, we turn other people into heroes.
Right. So it's like you might dramatize something in a way that fleshes out characters and makes them interesting, and that might make it exciting for people like a myth, but it seems like there's kind of a link between the sacred being almost like there being a fragility to it that needs to be protected by making these characters like perfect examples of like archetypes.
Yeah, I think that's a nice way of looking at it. But if you find yourself getting too caught up on the definitions of these and the strict boundaries between them, don't worry about it. At the end of the day, what's most important is that you've created a narrative, a shared narrative collection for whoever lives in your world. Some of that will be true, some of it will be false, some of it will be really important to the core of their identities, and some of it will just be stuff that they tell for fun or entertainment. But in order to have a fully fleshed out folklore for an entire people, you need to have all of these types of stories. Any last words before I move on? One question that has come up a couple times when I've recorded my Exolore episodes is, why are we talking about myths and stories? Do they necessarily have to have these on this world? Which I think gets at a question of the inevitability of folklore and religion. And this link takes you to a pretty cool BBC article. It was a psychological study about what happens in our brains when we follow religions and when we create them. That's a cool article. But the basic idea, the short answer is kind of yeah. For life forms that we are interested in telling stories about, and for life forms that your readers care about. So it's going to be difficult to write a fun and engaging story about a life form that's not intelligent, right? So like, this is probably a safe assumption to make, that the life forms in your world, if you're interested in telling a story about it, are going to be intelligent. And with intelligence comes curiosity and some form of language. Maybe it's not spoken language like we have it. Maybe they don't have a written language like we have. I've had a lot of fun thinking of other forms of language for characters in worlds that I've built, but these two seem to be pretty direct and inevitable consequences of intelligence if you approach them expansively and think that they don't have to exist exactly how they exist here on Earth. If you have those two things, curiosity and a way to communicate with other members of your group, you're going to start explaining the natural world around you. Because you're living in the world, you're seeing these funky things happen, like, oh, why is there this thunderstorm? Why is this person giving birth? Why is this river flooding over and over again at the same time every year? So you'll see these things happening in the natural world around you, and you'll want to explain them, so you'll come up with ways to explain them. Our human brains are wired to like stories or to pay attention and remember stories. Other brains might not necessarily be wired that way, but you are creating something for a human audience. So you will be presenting something in the form of a story or some kind of narration. So the explanations will take the form of stories, and that's what folklore is. Folklore is just stories that people tell. And since you're going to be telling stories about intelligent people, then it makes sense that they would tell stories too. Does that make sense, that loop there? Okay, cool. Also, it's just fun. I think creating myths and legends for the characters that I've just built in a world, I think it's one of the most fun parts of world building. So I think everyone should do it if they're building a world. But remember that organized religion, organized mythologies don't have to happen the way that we have them here on Earth, but it is probably pretty common, especially if you're dealing with human-ish life forms. And your human audience will expect your characters to revere or worship or respect or value something in the universe. The default answer for a lot of people is a god or a collection of gods, but maybe it's science. In my undergrad thesis, I created a race of people who, the most powerful people in this society value science. They worship science. It's like the only thing they care about. Maybe it's money. Maybe it's physical goods. In Neil Gaiman's American Gods, he creates gods about new things. So there are gods of the television, there are gods of radio, there are gods of the paved road, or like the path. And so you should probably have your characters value or worship something, but you have a lot of freedom in what that something is. Any questions about that? All right, so how does folklore actually form? Well, in your head, like practically, you're going to be mostly drawing on inspiration from other stories that you've heard here on Earth and using the world building the decisions that you've already made in your world building to adapt that story to your world. But like in real time, the way that humans created stories is that typically myths, these stories that are supposed to answer big questions, they often start out as explanations of natural phenomena. And this is why if you have a polytheistic religion of a group of people who believe in multiple gods, those gods typically have domain over specific things, because those gods are the creatures, the characters that our stories say are responsible for making those natural phenomena happen. So we have Thor, a god of thunder, because when people heard thunder, they explained it by saying that Thor created it. Or we have Hera, who's like a goddess of childbirth and the hearth. And that's because these are things that were present in people's everyday lives. Everyone knew that childbirth was a thing. Everyone knew that homes were a thing. Hopefully they had homes, and they wanted to take care of them. And so they told stories and created characters of a god, Hera, who was responsible, who had domain over that specific thing. This also explains why you find similar gods or gods who are responsible for similar things across cultures. So you can go to ancient Greece or ancient Mesopotamia, or like kind of recent, like Middle Ages Scandinavia or whatever. You're going to find gods of love, fire, wisdom, war, death, things that people experience everywhere, because that's how myths and religion are created. Legends and folk tales often have a kernel of truth, and this you don't have to think of the strict boundaries here either. But these are just, if you need to approach it as like a list of things to check off, then here are the different items that you might want to include on that list. So legends and folk tales have a kernel of truth that gets exaggerated over time. There's this awesome book by Thomas Bulfinch, Bulfinch's Mythology, and it's one of the sources that we read in my introduction to folklore classes, because it talks about how these exaggerated kind of magicified stories get created over time from mundane activities. So if you look at the labors of Hercules, for example, he's doing these really amazing things like cutting off hydra heads or stealing apples from a sacred garden, or wrangling a dragon, is that what it is? Or wrangling a really big snake that's terrorizing a town. And Bullfinch says that if you actually look at historical records and you look at the mundane things that actually happened, you can actually work out how stuff was exaggerated. So in the instance of Hercules slaying this giant snake that was terrorizing the town, what's more likely is that there was this mundane dude who wasn't Hercules. He wasn't the son of Zeus, but he was this regular guy who saw that there was this river that was flooding and about to destroy a town, and he did a lot of mundane but difficult physical labor to redirect that river so that it didn't destroy that town. And this regular guy, the actions of this dude got caught up in the myth, the legend of Hercules, and it got exaggerated over time. So this is a really cool thing where one legendary figure, like I keep saying Hercules, but there are other ones. One legendary figure can be made of lots of different people who did mundane but important things that then got exaggerated and lumped together. So there likely wasn't one King Arthur. There likely wasn't one Hercules. There likely wasn't, I'm trying to think of a female example and I'm coming up short, but these big legendary figures that everyone's heard about, there probably were more people doing small things that all got clumped together. The true stories, or the stories that people make up for fun, they evolve. Just like life forms evolve, stories evolve too. Every time a person is born, they have mutations. Well, every time a story is told by not even different people, like if you're the same person telling the same story, you might add changes, and those changes are like mutations. And as stories get brought to different locations, or they're told in different contexts, they'll pick up new elements, they'll drop old elements. This is really common in cultures that have a tradition of oral storytelling, which is most cultures at one point or another before they develop the technology to write things down and share things on something like the internet, where things can exist in an unchanged form because they're written and distributed in the same way to everyone. But one of my favorite things about bards and storytellers, people who made a living from telling stories, is that sometimes they just wouldn't want to tell part of the story, or sometimes they forgot a part of the story, or sometimes they were speaking to an audience that had different values than their previous audience, so they would change the story to adapt to who was hearing it. And in that way, stories change, even if they're based on true things, and even if people ascribe a lot of value to them. Does that make sense? Also, you can get similar stories from different parts of the world, and there are a couple different reasons for that. This link takes you to an article about a folklore study that thought that maybe it found a common ancestor for a bunch of different myths. So just like we have phylogenetic trees for biology, these trees where you can actually work backwards to figure out what your common ancestors are, we can do something similar with myths sometimes. And that doesn't mean that the common ancestor is the original myth, and it doesn't mean that the descendants are less valid, right? Because myth has meaning only, or folklore has meaning only in context. It has meaning because the people who hear the folklore and share the folklore believe in it. So just because something isn't the original doesn't mean it's less valid. So it's possible that you get stories in different parts, similar stories in different parts of the world, because they can actually be traced back to something closer to an original. But it's also possible that you get these stories in different parts of the world that have very similar elements. You can find rags to riches stories all over the world, and you can find adventure and quest stories all over the world, like the Iliad or the Odyssey. And that could also be because humans just experience the same things everywhere. If we're telling stories about natural phenomena that everyone experiences, then the stories will probably be similar, or it's not impossible for them to be similar. Any questions about any of that?
Not a question, but I just wanted to say if anyone wants to check it out, there's a brilliant video game called Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. And the whole thing of it is you lost your soul in a game of Cards with the Devil, and the task he gives you is to go out into the American country and collect stories. And as you move further south or west or away from where you are, you see the same stories coming back to you, different than when you originally told them, and picking them up changed over time. And it's such a cool thing to look through.
Oh, yeah. What's it called again? Where water tastes like
Where
wine?
the water tastes like wine.
Nice.
The soundtrack is really good.
Awesome. I'll check that out. That sounds like, yeah, being able to experience the sharing and the changing and the evolution of stories, I think that's a really valuable experience.
And it's such a cool thing that takes place through it's like all about the American mythos, and it's so cool.
Nice. Well, I love that. Awesome. Thanks, Andy.
Mm-hmm.
You have so many great examples.
Sell books for 10 years, it happens.
All right, so the functions of folklore is something that you should keep in mind when you are creating new stuff for your world. One of the biggest functions of folklore is education. It's pedagogical, but it teaches different things. So it can teach about the natural world on big and small scale. So it can teach you how eclipses happen through myths, but it can also teach you which foods are safe to eat, which rivers are easier to cross, which trees you should pay attention to if you're trying to go north or navigate in any way. These are stories that people like tell around the campfire, or they'll tell to their kids to pass on knowledge that they think the next generation should have to survive. But it can also educate about social norms and values. So a lot of the grim fairy tales, especially in the kind of sugary versions that Disney produced, are about teaching children how to behave. So Little Red Riding Hood is usually given as an example of a story that's teaching kids, don't stray too far from the beaten path, or bad things will happen to you and your grandma will be eaten by a wolf. You don't want that. Be a good kid. And that's one of the things that folklore can be used for. Folklore can also just be for fun, because life is hard and people need a way to blow off steam. And one of the oldest ways of doing that is to listen to a story, because it can transport you out of your world. And this, I think, is a beautiful thing to incorporate into the stories that you tell. So you're telling a story. If you like write a book or something, let's limit it for the example. If you write a fiction book and other people read it, they're reading it to be entertained, unless you're trying to make it educational. Like you can write books that teach about specific things. I'm rewatching The Good Place, and it's a TV show that's entertaining, but it's also teaching about philosophy and moral philosophy throughout the ages. But people are reading your book because they want to be entertained, because they want to be able to stop thinking about the issues in their lives, and they want to be transported to this other world. And that's why world building is so important if you're creating a story. But it's also really fun to give your characters that same thing too. So your characters can tell stories and to each other, or they can remember stories that they've heard in the past as a way of escaping the hard things in their lives. And so incorporating that nested story is a nice way of showing that your characters are quote unquote human, even if they're not actually human, showing that your characters also need a break. And then your human readers, your human audience will be able to relate to that. So that's, nesting stories is just a nice way to do that. So entertaining, but also providing hope. The reason that hero stories are so common is because sometimes people feel like crap and they want to believe that they can do better, or that someone else might be their own personal hero and come save them from whatever difficulties they're facing. Folklore can also be used to justify cultural rituals, like in the christening. It came back, or it can establish shared identities. So what could happen is you have a person from culture A who has traveled all over the world, and now they're in place B. No, that's difficult. But if you have a person who's been traveling around the world and they haven't interacted with anyone from their own culture in a really long time, and they like walk into a bar and they meet someone who's from their hometown or from their home state, they can talk about the football team, like their local football team, and that's a version of shared folklore. The stories of who won what games, or who threw this touchdown pass. So you can bond over that. But it's hard to think of something specific. I can bond with other people over favorite books and favorite TV shows, because that's now included. That then becomes our shared folklore, the shared experiences that we can bond over. But folklore also has a dark side. It can be used to exercise social control. So a lot of Western religion, at least, is has a lot of, if you do this wrong thing, then you'll go to this bad place, or something bad will happen to you. So there is a lot of control baked into Western religion. But just like the magic that's often included in these fiction stories, folklore can be used for good or evil. And I think it makes really compelling stories when you show both, when you show it being used for good and for evil within the same story. Next, we're going to talk about types of folklore that I think you should consider including in your stories, or thinking about for your stories, but it's now 2 o'clock, so I want to give you a break. So we'll come back in 5 minutes and talk about different large categories of folklore that you might want to think about. bring it back. Start to come back.
I was wondering if I could share something about
Yeah.
the last slide that came to mind.
Yeah. Do you want to share your screen?
Sure. Yeah. So this reminded me of this amazing graph that I found a little while ago this year. It's from a paper that came out last year where it was like this analysis of belief systems in like lots of different cultures throughout history, and it basically found that so this graph is showing like social complexity graphed against like social complexity over time of different cultures, and like I think it's basically like a average out of all of them with like standard deviation or whatever. But basically the finding is that cultures that come up with gods that care about how humans treat one another and maybe punish transgressions of those things, that happens like after, not before society reaches a certain complexity, which is around like a population of about 1 million or so. So basically the idea is that like when societies get big and complex enough that they need to like, you need to kind of manage maybe multi-ethnic groups of people kind of having shared values, then that's when you see like that they come up with these belief systems where gods are punishing you if you don't treat each other well.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Thank you.
Anyway.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up. I have nothing to add. That was great. If you don't mind, I'll probably incorporate this into the next iteration of this class.
Yeah, no problem.
Cool. All right. So this is just a list of the types of myths and folklore that I think you might want to consider fleshing out. Some of them might not be relevant to your particular story if you have a story in mind for your world, but I think they would all be fun to think of. So creation and origin stories. How did we get here? That can be really fantastical, like creationism, like one very powerful being spent 7 days creating the universe, or it can be more scientific. So James, I know your story is about this group of people who find themselves living in the asteroid belt, but they're descended from humans. So their origin story can be how, like, why are we on these ships? Why are we living in the asteroid belt? How did we get here? Doomsday myths. How do people think the world will end? Do they even think the world will end? If you have a group of people who think that the world is unchanging and it's going to exist in its current state for eternity, that creates different motivations and is associated with different values and beliefs than a group of people who are like, yeah, in 4,000 years, some god is going to come down on a giant crow and wipe us all out because we've been bad. Like those are different types of people, and you'll get different behaviors out of those beliefs. If your people are polytheistic, which gods are responsible for what things? Now, we know that you should really think about how socially complex your world is, although hopefully you would have thought about that no matter what. So think about if there are gods, what are they responsible for? If there aren't gods, and if you're creating society that's more like what we have today, where there are some people who like actually follow polytheistic religions, but they are definitely the minority. Most people are either atheists or agnostic or believe in monotheism. If you're creating that type of world, then instead of gods, think about just like really powerful figures. Like who are the Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezoses of your world? And what are they in charge of? Because you can think of different aspects of life that gods used to be in charge of, like thunder and childbirth. You can think of those as industries. So like who runs the internet? Who runs communication sharing? Who runs food distribution? Things like that. Think about the legendary figures. These are going to tell you what archetypes the people in your world admire. The fact that our legendary figures are people like Johnny Appleseed and Paul Bunyan and maybe Joan of Arc or Mulan. These archetypes of characters, so not specifically these characters, but the character profiles will tell you a lot about what people admire. A group of people who have a lot of like, even though it's not always been called this, but like climate activist heroes, that's going to be a very different world from one where all of those like revered legendary figures are war heroes. So think about that difference and think about how you want to incorporate it into your world. Think about the children's fairy tales, although this also depends on what the family unit is like. Maybe you've created a world where the dominant species doesn't have to care for their young for a really long time because maybe they aren't as helpless as humans. I mean, like a baby horse can run after like a couple of weeks, so there's not necessarily a need for children's folk tales and children's bedtime stories if the parents don't have to look after the young for a long time, or if there's not sexual reproduction at all, if you just have like cloning. So as an adult, you're like, okay, I want to make another one of me now, and you do it, and then they just go off and live their own life. Children's folk tales won't necessarily be a thing. But think about whether or not you need this. If you decide you don't, think about what would exist instead, because there would still be stories around. In the biology lecture, Stacy, the guest lecturer, talked about how there's just like genetic material kind of floating around, just ambient genetic material. And I think of folklore in the same way. There are ambient stories. We might not necessarily be thinking about them all the time, but they're always around us. They always exist, and we can easily draw from them or use them as a lens to view our world. Also think about the afterlife. Do your people die? That's question number one. That should be a question you answer when you're thinking about biology. If they die, what do they think happens to them after they die? And are they right or are they wrong? Because you'll know that, but they won't know that. And you should think about whether or not you want your reader to know that or your audience. So think about how they interact with the afterlife and how you want your audience to view them interacting with the afterlife. This list isn't exhaustive. It's what I came up with in a brainstorm when I was making this slide. So, there are definitely other things that you should consider. I don't like saying should. There are other things that you could consider, other things that might be more relevant to your world and a story you want to inhabit it. But this is just to get the juices flowing. Any questions about these? Cool. And then just one last plug for folk art, because this entire lecture has been about folklore, is the stories, the shared like narrative knowledge, folk art is the shared physical expressions of cultural identity. Religion and arts or crafts, like handiwork, they often go hand in hand. This can be the creation of religious artifacts, or so like things like the crucifix, for example. Those are items that are associated with a certain religion that people will make over and over again. Or you could have a case where the production of the thing is the actual important part, like that's the ritualized activity. So you can have I'm struggling to think of an example, but I can imagine a world where there's a really important, like maybe spiders, that's a good one. If you have a world where either the main characters are spiders or there are just a lot of spiders in the natural world, then there might be a spider god, and with spiders could come weaving, and so maybe you have this entire ritual built around weaving while you pray to these spider gods. And so like you weave your prayers into whatever you're creating, and that's a ritual production, and that's one example of folk art. The items created depend on the values. So I said like weaving, and that was because there was a god who was the god of weaving, who was really important to this imaginary culture, and that was because there are a lot of spiders in the environment. So you can see it, like the progression all the way through. So it depends on the values, and it depends on the needs of the people and what resources they have available. So it could go either way. You can have religious production of food, for example. There are religious feasts, and so the production of food for those religious feasts is really important because people need to eat. But there are also examples of people, and sometimes this is just a flex, and sometimes this is used as like an honest signal of wealth and prosperity. But sometimes you have examples of people who have rituals where they make stuff that they don't need, or they make stuff out of a very scarce resource just to show that they can. I'm reading this book that talks about the history of human civilization in terms of beverages. So it starts with beer, and then it moves to wine, and then like coffee and tea and spirits. But it was talking about this ancient king in Mesopotamia after beer was really a thing, but before wine had become easier to produce. And this king, at this ritual feast that was tied to religion, he wanted to show off his wealth. And so he imported a lot of very expensive, very difficult to make wine. And so that has a lot of cultural context wrapped into it. It talks about resources because wine is valuable because it's scarce. It talks about the needs of the people because people need to consume water, but at the time, a lot of water was really dangerous to drink, and so alcoholic beverages, especially beer, because it involved boiling water, was often safer to drink than water. Also, beer used to be a lot weaker, so they were feeding kids beer and ale, but like they weren't getting drunk, so it's fine. And it depends on the values of the people. So clearly, this king valued wealth and wanted other people to think that he was really prosperous, because then they would think that his kingdom was prosperous, and that indicates value. So all of this is really wrapped up together. And honestly, the hardest part of world building, once you get to this culture stage, is keeping everything in your head and finding ways to connect all of the decisions you've previously made to all of the decisions you're making now, and then leave open the door for connections to decisions that you make in the future. That's the hardest part of world building, is just keeping that all in your head at once. I don't know why folk art was how I got there, but you know, that's what we have. Any questions about folk art before we move on?
What's that picture?
This picture, can you all see it, or is anything in the way? I took a blacksmithing class a year ago, and this is me. I think at this point I was soldering 2 pieces of steel together because I wanted to create the Steelers logo out of steel that I like cut and processed myself. My father's a big Steelers fan. I'm from Pittsburgh. Yeah. So blacksmithing is a traditional craft. Another thing to think about in your world: what are the traditional crafts? Weaving, beer making, blacksmithing, needlepoint is traditionally on Earth considered a woman's art. But maybe you can create a world where needlepoint and like things like sewing and knitting and embroidery, maybe you can create a world where that's like a very macho thing, and like gender norms are similar to Earth, but for some reason men are the ones who are supposed to sew things. Or you can totally flip it on its head, and maybe like needlepoint is a very macho thing, and women are the people who do it. So like women are like the strong macho people, or like whatever. You can play with gender norms. You can play with who does what crafts, or what crafts are popular when. I think typically we associate blacksmithing with like the Middle Ages, because they were making like swords and shields and other things to kill people with. And you can imagine a world where maybe instead of going to the Apple store to get my phone, it's much more common for me to like, maybe everyone has their own personal forge, and so it's much more common for tech companies to give out blueprints instead of actual products, and then it's expected that people make the products themselves. And that is associated with different sets of values, right? That those are values that are like, if you're going to use something, it should be something that you've made yourself. And that means there's probably going to be a lot of ritual involved. And over time, that ritual can move from being more religious to just being something that people enjoy doing. And then eventually it's just something that people have always done, so you're going to keep doing it. Yeah, there are lots of examples of how you just can follow that thread. It started with, what is that picture? That's a picture of me blacksmithing. I'm rambly today, I'm sorry. Okay.
No, that's great.
All right, let's talk about how you're going to use folklore in your world. So these are the questions that you should think about. I'm just going to put them all here so we can actually get into the exercise. But what stories do people tell on your world? I gave you that list before of different types of folklore that you can use that as a starting point. You know, creation myths, doomsday myths, afterlife. What legendary or mythical figures are people familiar with? I've used Hercules as an example because it's an example that I know you're all familiar with. So I know I can say Hercules and you won't be confused. So what are the corresponding figures on your world? You know, someone can mention this name and everyone else who hears it just like automatically knows what it means. How are stories and myths shared and passed to future generations? We talked about oral storytelling and how that can lead to the morphing and the evolution of stories and myths, but that's not the only way they can change, and that's not the only way they can be passed on. This gets into decisions that you have to make about how advanced is your civilization. Can they write, or do they have any way of like recording their knowledge and their information? How does that get seen by future generations? There's this cool show on Netflix that I've been meaning to watch but haven't started yet called Utopia Falls. And based on the trailer, it looks like a future civilization where our knowledge has been like put on a computer, and then they create a utopia, and then some kids find this computer with ancient knowledge, and so like they start learning about hip hop and dancing and other things. So think about how knowledge is shared and passed on. How do these stories interact with people's beliefs, their values? You just have to keep everything in your head. What do they value? What does that mean? And then be creative with it. Try to make those connections wherever you can. How are myths and religion used to drive or disrupt intergroup conflict? You know, the Crusades are an example on Earth of religion driving conflict, but big international humanitarian aid efforts are also examples of sometimes it's just like good people, but a lot of the time or sometimes, I don't know what the distribution is, but many times it's rooted in religion. It's rooted in religious beliefs that you should help people and you should, you know, do good deeds, things like that. That sentence made me sound like a terrible person. Do good things and things like that. Also, think about what holidays or rituals there are. How did those rituals start? How have they been elaborated or changed over time? So going back to that example of maybe weaving your prayers to the spider god into whatever product you're creating, that ritual is just like what I just described is a snapshot in time. And in the future, that ritual will be different. And in the past, it was also different because these rituals evolve. Holidays evolve. The way we celebrate something like Christmas now is very different from the way Christmas was celebrated even like 200 years ago. Yeah, so that's what I would like you to think about. Now, I want to give you all some time to come up with a piece of folklore. It can be historical, it can be mythical, it can be legendary. You can say just like fuck it to all the categories and come up with your own thing without thinking about how to classify it. So I want to give you 5 minutes. I'll check in and I will give you another 5 minutes if you need it. But I want to give you time to think about, come up with a piece of folklore from your world. And then we'll share it. That time starts now. If you have questions or anything, feel free to either message me privately in the chat or ask the class.